In 2009, Dalia was actually appointed by President Obama to the President's Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnership. She's probably one of the most famous Muslim American women, to the point that, like, my mother always tells me, "I saw Dalia Mogahed. Why don't you talk to her?" Delia, she has a very long list of accomplishments that I will not embarrass her with. She has an MBA from the University of Pittsburgh, and before joining Gallup, actually did a lot of work in marketing with Procter & Gamble and other organizations. And she's going to talk to us today about the arithmetic of the Egyptian Revolution.
Thank you. Well, let me move to the podium so you can see. Is this going to work? Yes. Good evening, everyone. First of all, I want to say what an honor it is to be here, and I want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. It's especially an honor because I'm getting to present about something that I'm very passionate about. I was in Egypt shortly before the revolution. In fact, it was late December of 2010. And I remember leaving the country on one of my regular trips back, really feeling extremely depressed about the state of the country and how people were feeling. It was a country, it was almost a country I didn't recognize. Egyptians, I remember telling my friend, had lost their sweetness. They just weren't the same people that I always knew. There was sort of a level of despair that I'd never seen before. But at the same time, there was something else I saw in that trip in late December, and that was with that at the same time that there was this sense that things had gone very badly, there was also a new sense of not wanting to take it anymore. And I think that was the spark of what was to come. Because 2011 was really a year where things fundamentally shifted. Power shifted from the few to the many. From carefully guarded airwaves to networked social media. From power shifted from Oval Offices to public squares. And so what I'd like to talk to you today is about an empirical look at what led up to this fundamental shift, as well as how things have changed over the past year. When we look at how things had been going before the historical events of January 2011, what you see is this, something really interesting in this dynamic, which was that Egypt's on paper economic growth was something that the country was getting literally awards for. It had a very healthy 5% GDP per capita growth over the past several years in a row. So on paper, Egypt, and in fact, just coincidentally, Tunisia, were doing quite well in terms of their economic growth due to some aggressive liberalization and economic reform policies. But what was underneath the surface, and that's what we study, is the emotions and the aspirations behind the headlines, is that people's actual lives were getting harder. And we've been tracking at Gallup Egyptian public opinion since 2001. We just look at a snapshot here. We've been looking at something we call life satisfaction or life evaluation index. And what you see here is that the Egyptian public's sense of how their life was going today, as well as how it will look in 5 years, was steadily declining as GDP per capita was growing, with the exception of one group, and that is the top 20% of the income bracket. That's the light blue line. You do see a slight increase in their life satisfaction as GDP per capita went up. So wealth was being created. It just was being held by a very small group of people, while the rest of the population essentially saw their lives getting worse and worse, especially the poorest 20%, whose decline was the most severe. So that was the first underlying dynamic before the revolution that we uncovered in our research, which was economic growth without prosperity.
Sorry, could you just tell me what the y-axis is exactly? I know you're saying life satisfaction.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sure. I should explain it a little bit more. The y-axis is the percent of the people that we identify as something called, identify in a category called thriving, which is a category that you're, basically it's if you have a high sense of your life today as well as a high sense of hope for tomorrow. So the percentage of Egyptians that are classified as thriving was decreasing. Now, at the same time that we had a GDP growth of 5%, we had an actual declining public satisfaction with basic government or state functions. So why this is significant is because around the world, so we do global research in more than 100 countries. Economic growth does actually tend to correlate very well with both increased public life satisfaction as well as increased satisfaction with basic functions of the state. But everything was moving in the wrong direction in Egypt. One reason that GDP growth translates into better lives for people is because there are mechanisms by which the population can access economic growth. And some of those are starting a business. But you see that many of those access points to that economic growth were in fact blocked. That government made it harder for people to start a business. That job creation was actually lower, or people's satisfaction with it was lower despite economic growth. That people's perceived sense of the economic condition actually fell despite on paper economic growth. Housing had become much less affordable, and so on. This, and again, this looks at the issue over time. What this all sort of translates into is that people's lives were getting harder despite economic growth, their satisfaction with the state was falling, and there was an unsatisfied democratic aspiration within the Egyptian public. So Egyptians as a population are the most likely Muslim majority society we study to say that moving toward greater democracy will help Muslims progress, where 88% of the population has this view. At the same time, the Egyptian public in 2010 were the least likely in the world of more than 100 countries that we asked this question of to actually report expressing an opinion to a public official. So you have this situation of a country where it has the highest democratic aspirations of any Muslim majority society and the lowest of any country in the world in terms of actual practiced democracy of some kind. at the same time that we had these other two dynamics where people's lives were progressively getting worse as there was a small group getting richer, that their satisfaction with basic state functions was falling. They also felt less and less free. So if you think about different societies around the world, you really don't always need a lot of freedom to keep your people fairly happy. But you do need one thing or another. You can either take really good care of your people and have a state that functions well, that provides really good services. I think of Singapore as a great example of that. Or you can have a state where people feel rather free, even if the state is not providing all of those services. But if you have both declining at the same time, you have a very volatile situation. And that's exactly what was happening in Egypt. Not only were people less and less satisfied with the functions of the state, but they were also less and less satisfied with their personal freedom. And in 2010, roughly a quarter believed in the honesty of the elections. A lot of times people see that number and wonder why it was so high. 28% is of course 28% of the people higher than what we would expect, but you do have to remember that 28% is about 50% of the people are essentially politically illiterate. So for only 28% to believe in the honesty of the election is really quite low and alarmingly so. So what happened after the revolution? What has changed? We've been tracking Egypt's public opinion throughout the past year. Roughly every 6 weeks, we took a measure. And the first thing that has happened is that people believe very different things about their future than they used to. So I'll start with right before the revolution, in the fall of 2010. We actually did a survey in Egypt around the October-November time period, just about a month or two before the events of January. And what we measured there was something very interesting. First, people's rating of their lives today was the lowest we had ever measured it since 2001. It had never been lower for that entire decade. But what was perhaps even more alarming is that their sense of where their lives would be in 5 years was was also very, very low. There was very little difference between how people felt about their lives today and where they thought their lives would be in 5 years. So that gap between these two lines is hope, is optimism, and it had become very, very narrow. Now look what actually happened right after the revolution, in March of 2011. People actually rated their lives even worse than they had right before. But what is really different and really significant is this line. The gap has grown quite significantly. In fact, it's never been this high. The gap between where people believe their lives are today and where they will be in 5 years is the real fruit of the revolution. There is new hope in Egypt. And surprisingly, for many of us who have been watching Egypt over the past year, that gap, that sense of hope, has endured throughout this past year, all the way to January of 2012. Egyptians do expect a better future.
Sorry, can you again help me to interpret this graph? So, am I right to say that the level of hope that existed right after the revolution was the level of expectation of a brighter future was still lower than that which existed in spring of 2009? So you're right, the gap is bigger, but the expectation is still lower. Right after the
right
revolution.
here. Yes,
Yeah.
the expectation absolutely,
More-
absolute number is lower, but
And what do
when
those
something
numbers
is,
mean? Sorry, just what are 5,
Sure.
6, 7, what is that?
this is an average of the population rating their lives from on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is the worst possible life you can imagine and 10 is the best possible life you can imagine. So when someone is rating their current life at essentially a 3.5, this is the national average, then to say that that life in 5 years will be this much different is sort of what we're looking at, a relative difference. But you're absolutely right. The way that people believe their lives would be in the spring of 2011 on an absolute scale was higher. The gap is in terms of how much improvement they believe will occur over the past.
And we're assuming the confidence interval here is very narrow, or what's the plus minus on each of these?
Well, I can talk about the plus minus in a second, but this is statistically significant. There was a significant rise in the optimism on in terms of regarding the revolution after the election, and it was an election that most people believed was fair. So what you find is that right here in the summer, so that these two lines, one is that you expect your life to, you expect that life will improve after Mubarak's resignation. And it tracks the percentage of people who say that they think their lives will improve. This is where it was in February of 2000, February or March of 2011, and you see that it actually does dip around the summer, and then goes back up in the time period of after the election in December, and then also in January. But January somehow isn't showing up as the last data point. The other thing that tracks very closely is, remember this number around the confidence in the honesty of election. It started out here in October of 2010 at 28% and went up with the revolution, actually came down with this slump in the summer around optimism, and has gone back up with the election. So the election in December has given new, sort of a second wind to people's optimism about the revolution. And that's important because the success of the Egyptian revolution has given people new faith in the ability for people to make change peacefully. People's faith in peaceful means of change has been strengthened by what they believe was a successful, that there has been change that has been made in Egypt. So what we've been tracking in Egypt and around the world is this question around, do you believe that people can make change through peaceful means alone? Can oppressed people change their situation through peaceful means alone? And what we've been tracking here is, peaceful means alone will work and peaceful means alone will not work. Those are the two questions. And in Egyptians, in majorities, have always said, yes, peaceful means alone will work. But it went up from, you'll see here, 60% in October of 2010, and did go up to 79%. Now, it's interesting that it went down a little bit in this time period around when Syria and Libya were getting started and at their height, but then again went back up, and it's now at 85%, again tracking that optimism with the revolution. But even when we do further analysis, we find that those who believe in peaceful means alone are significantly more likely to have faith in things like the honesty of elections, the national government, the judicial system, and the local police, state functions. If the revolution doesn't truly produce better institutions, there's a flip side to this, that as people gain more confidence in their state functions, they have more faith in peaceful means of change. But that also means if the revolution doesn't truly deliver on better institutions that are trustworthy, that faith in peaceful means alone could also be eroded. Now, many will look at some of this research and think that it just means Egyptians have now very high expectations of the state. The state is, again, the paternal symbol that will solve all their problems for them. But I think that this analysis would again miss a really important fruit of the revolution that is far away from the cameras of the Tahrir Square, which is that the Egyptian people have really changed not only their expectations of the state, but of themselves. In a country that was always known for passive resignation, we now have 90% saying that if there's a problem in their community, they believe it's up to them to fix it. We also have most people believing that they have the power, not only the responsibility, but the power to fix problems in their community. And again, it did rise significantly with the election, from 55 to 64%. Since the election was something that most people believed was valid and legitimate, they do expect their elected officials to wield real political power and expect the ruling military council to yield power to civilian elected officials as soon as a president is elected. So if you look at this question here, it's the military remaining involved in politics after the presidential election, is it a good thing or a bad thing for the country? The general public, you have 63% who say it's a good thing, a bad thing, and 27% who say it's a good thing. But what's, I think, very important and interesting to note is that not only do a majority want the military to leave power after the presidential election, but that there's really no difference across political persuasion. So when you look at this question by supporters of the Free Egyptian Party, which is the most prominent liberal party, the Freedom and Justice Party, the one associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, as well as the Noor Party, the one associated with the Salafis, they are in agreement that the military remaining in power is a bad thing for the country. It's also important to note that the vast majority of Egyptians still have confidence in SCAF. It's 89% saying they still have confidence in the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. But that confidence does not translate into wanting them to remain in power. The other thing to understand about the dynamics of this past election is, what does it mean that a majority of the Egyptian parliament is made up of Muslim Brotherhood-affiliated Freedom and Justice Party and Noor Party? Does this mean that the Egyptian people have given the parliament an ideological public mandate? And the answer is, the answer to that is a likely no, for the following reasons. First, the win in December for freedom and justice and Noor is not the product of decades of ideological followership. It's a fairly recent phenomenon in terms of support. So we've been tracking people's support for different parties and movements in Egypt since March of 2011. And sorry, I'm just noticing that the y-axis should be percentages of support, so I apologize for that. But in March, the support for the Muslim Brotherhood was 15%. And you'll notice here, it's around 44% in December. So our measurement is fairly accurate in December in terms of reflecting what they actually got in Parliament. And yet it was only 15% in March of 2011. How do we understand the 44% in December? Can we really say that this is a group of people that are truly ideological followers, or rather ones that were won over by organized and well-executed campaigning? And it's interesting that the rise is quite steady for both the Muslim Brotherhood as well as the Salafis as a movement. Right here in June, the Salafis and the April 6 movement had the same level of support. This April 6 movement stayed flat, and the Salafis shot up.
April 6 isn't a party.
Right, it's a movement. We did ask about parties and movements. I would appreciate, actually, if we could keep the questions for the end. The same thing with the Free Egyptian Party right here. What you really see is that the liberal parties have stayed flat, and the Islamists have shot up. Not because they started out with greater ideological support, really, but much more that they have grown support very quickly leading up to the election. But regardless of who people support, I think what's really important to take away is that their priorities for the next government are identical. So whether someone said that they supported Noor Party, Freedom and Justice, or the Free Egyptian Party, their top 4 priorities for the next government is not an ideological social program. It's basic needs that they all agree on. Employment, especially employing young people, the economy and the cost of living, security, stability, and education. Those are the top 4 priorities for the next government, regardless of party support. And that's an important message really to send to the Egyptian parliament, that they can't take the win that they've received as an ideological mandate. People are expecting real policy results, not rhetoric. And you did notice that number 3 was security. Fear and insecurity is a huge problem in Egypt, as you can see here. So the blue line is people not feeling that they can, people not feeling safe walking alone at night. And again, this is something we've been tracking for several years. So in 2009, 27% of Egyptians said they didn't feel safe walking alone at night. It went down to 17% in 2010. And then in March, right after, of course, the resignation is when we started measuring, in March of 2011, shot up to 39% and has stayed fairly similar over the past year. Fear has shot up. But we've also been tracking actual crime rates. We've actually asked people, and we've been tracking it, have you actually had theft or assault occur to you or to someone in your household? That number has stayed fairly steady. And even in January of 2012, it was the same as it was in 2009 and 2010. The actual crime rate in Egypt hasn't changed, but people's sense of fear has skyrocketed. And so this is really important information because we have to ask, where is this fear coming from? Why are people so afraid? Who is benefiting from fear in the Egyptian public? There's also fear in Washington, though. There was a great deal of concern with the results of the election. And especially because this parliament is going to oversee the writing of a new constitution for Egypt. Now, it's very hard to predict what these new politicians will do. And this is not to say that things are going to go great. But if we do look at their supporters, what we find is that those who support the Freedom and Justice Party or the Free Egyptian Party, or if they're just the general public, they're very similar in their level of support for freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of assembly in a new constitution for a new country. The takeaway here is that the ideological differences on these fundamental questions of basic freedoms between these parties is essentially non-existent among their supporters. And I think that's good news for Egypt moving forward. The other major concern is of course regarding the peace treaty with Israel. The Egyptian public is split, not split along ideological lines or political ideologies, but split just in half generally. Supporters of the newer party, 51% say the peace treaty is a good thing, 42% say it's a bad thing. You go over here to the Free Egyptians, the liberals, 48% say it's a good thing, 46% say it's a bad thing. There is no one group that if we were to just help get them into power, everything would be okay. There is just disagreement within the Egyptian people, and that means that it will require deep engagement with the public on the benefits of peace. And that becomes more and more difficult because there is a mounting fear of American influence. And this is just one example of that, and that's the percentage of people who favor U.S. aid. Now, we have to also take into consideration the tremendous economic hardships that people are feeling in Egypt. And despite of that, there is great opposition to economic aid. Where if you look at, the blue line is people who favor U.S. economic aid. It was about 40% people who favored it in March, and it has gone down to the teens. But it's even worse when you ask about aid to political groups in Egypt, or even aid to civil society. There is a fear of the idea that aid is being used to as leverage for political influence in Egypt. And I say that for one other reason, is if we actually did an interesting analysis in March, right in the beginning, March of 2011, on those, on this issue of aid to political groups. And we actually found that opposition was strongest among people who thought that the United States should be Egypt's political model. So those who believe that Egypt should emulate the U.S. as a political model were even more likely to oppose American aid to Egyptian political groups. So it's not simply a hatred of America or a rejection of America, but rather the data suggests that it comes out of a sense of wanting true independence. So what does the path forward look like? What should we expect in the future? The next government, if it has any chance of success, will have to focus primarily on economic development. And I would say the same about any engagement with Egypt right now. It has to be much heavier on economic development and trade, and far lighter on trying to get into the interworkings of political reform. Institution building has to be the next phase, though. If these institutions don't truly eventually deliver on the Egyptian people's new expectations of their government and of their country, many of the real fruits of the revolution, mostly, especially including people's new faith and peaceful means of change, may be at risk. And then third, a different kind of international relations. Many of the leverage, many of the tools of leverage that we've used to manage our relationship with Egypt are no longer effective. People are rejecting aid. Just interacting with a powerful executive is no longer a viable option. We have to figure out a different kind of engagement with Egypt that takes into account its public in a much more substantial way. And with that, I look forward to your questions.
So we have until 7 o'clock. Why don't you have a seat? And usually I abuse my position and ask the first question, but since I've already done that, we'll open it up for others.
Yeah, that'd be great.
You point out that public opinion in Egypt is sharply declining, and its approval of American economic aid. And I think you have that. I think it most recently was down to about 10%. And I'm wondering why that is, and wondering if the fact that most of our aid to Egypt goes to the military is connected with that.
Well, that could be definitely a part of it. And I'd love to also have other people who have thoughts on that also chime in. My understanding of the main reasons why people are less and less inclined toward aid is because they feel that it creates a dependency that hurts Egypt's political and economic independence. That there's a new sense of independence, that economic aid has created a dynamic where Egyptians believe that they've always been able to feed themselves for thousands of years, and suddenly they depend on American wheat to make bread. It's this idea of it's hurting more than it's helping, and they are less and less, they believe that they can find ways to no longer be in debt in that way.
Charles.
Does the SCAF have a candidate in the presidential election? They must be thinking about this.
The SCAD?
The Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, the military.
They haven't officially endorsed anybody.
What are the trends?
Well, I mean, we don't,
She's a scientist.
we only look at the public. We actually don't survey the SCAF.
You had a great piece of data that you alluded to, and it was a blockbuster piece of data that in support of your argument. I just wanted you to elaborate on it. You said that people who view the U.S. as a model are far more likely to oppose U.S. aid than to. Mm-hmm. Can you give us a sense of the magnitude of that effect? That should be like a big slide, and it wasn't.
Right. Hi, Cynthia. Nice to see you. Yeah, well, what we found is that basically those who view the U.S. as a model, 88% of them opposed aid to political groups. To political groups, not economic aid. That wasn't aid, I think. That was aid to political groups. And the difference was from 88 to 75%, which was the general public. And that's statistically significant and something we would consider important. Especially because we wanted to know if rejection of American aid to political groups was out of not liking American values, not liking American politics, or out of a sense of, why do most Americans oppose foreign funding to campaigns? Well, because we want our independence. And it really comes more from that than just a sort of xenophobia.
What percentage of Egyptians would you say view the U.S. as a model?
Well, it was only about 12%, but the idea of, I do want to clarify this idea of viewing countries as models, because we do ask this question as an open end. So you can pick any country in the whole wide world. Any country, can kind of be mentioned. And you can also say no model, which is the most frequent response. Egyptians don't want anybody to be their model, of course. So a double-digit number is quite significant for that too.
Well, just to follow up on that, so the most popular was no model. What's after that? What's the other countries that are in the running as models?
Well, the top three countries, that could do a whole talk on models for Egypt, are the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. I did a whole analysis of who's choosing Saudi and why.
Yeah, who's got it?
Tell us.
Well, they're less educated and not more religious, and they're not favoring sort of the Salafis more. All the things I expected I didn't find in that group. But they're more likely to feel somewhat left behind by the revolution. They're more likely to feel that life hasn't gotten better. It hasn't gotten worse, but it's sort of just stayed the same. And I don't think the data is conclusive. It just tells us what it isn't, which is, it doesn't seem ideological. It seems more maybe a not very well thought out political opinion. They do tend to be uneducated people, maybe looking at Saudi more, not in terms of understanding the intricacies of their political system, but more with a certain kind of aura or brand rather than a detailed political science view. Now, the most educated, sort of the elite, are actually choosing Turkey. And then America's in the middle. we're getting kind of the in-between.
The interesting thing about Saudi Arabia, Ahram did a survey and found the same thing, and the analyses there seem to suggest that, look, lots of people would love to get a job in Saudi Arabia, and so that's part of what drives this. And I wish I could get a job there, so you kind of admire the clip. You, sir.
My question is regarding the Salafist party, which you said it grew up for the last year or so, and it wasn't really a political party before, and you said it's not attributed to an ideological support. Is this due to a special funding campaign? They were never seen by the people to trust their policies or plans. So through special funding or campaigns, who's funding them, and would it be another party who has special funding would succeed?
Well, I mean, so I think what you're asking is how did their support grow? Is it because of outside funding?
Possible. I did not know about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean...
And it's not ideological, and they've never been trying before in that. How did they get this?
Well, I think, first of all, I think we have to understand the dynamics in Egypt right now. So if we compare it to the United States, just even though they're so different in terms of their development as a democracy, but in Egypt you had 90% of the people saying that they planned on voting in the parliamentary election. 90%. Now, of course, that wasn't the turnout, but it's just a measure of enthusiasm, right, for the vote. But at the same time that you had 90% planning on voting, no higher than about 15% had actually support for one group or another. So you have this huge amount of enthusiasm for voting as a concept with just this leadership vacuum, with a vacuum of any party affiliation. So you have a nation of undecideds who are very enthusiastic about voting. Now, a lot of times, if, here in this country, if there isn't a candidate that you're super excited about, especially in like a congressional race, you may just stay home. In Egypt, really, the actual turnout was actually quite high among both men and women. So people did go out, but you have a nation of undecideds who are adamant about voting, and very little, loyalty to one group or another. They're going to be very susceptible, if you sort of think about that dynamic, to any kind of suggestion, to literally a flyer on the way to the ballot box. And what you found is that essentially, if you go out, and everyone I've talked to who went and observed the election said that the Salafis and the Muslim Brotherhood had the field almost to themselves in terms of campaigning. They were the only ones out there. They were the only ones who had an organized campaign. Now, how did the Salafis create an organized campaign? Who funded it? How did it happen? That's beyond kind of what the scope of my talk, but they did. And I think our research is pretty clear that that's how they won, because their support isn't this long-term, deep ideological followership that they had that we just never knew about, because then you would find that support as early as March, but it really grew as a result of it's the product of an effective campaign.
Can I just push you a little bit on this, because
Yeah.
I think you probably have some great data that can elaborate, and I think this follows up on his question. So the kind of alternative hypothesis would be, if I look at any surveys done of Egypt in the last 15 years, from surveys done by Ahram to the World Values Survey to I bet your own surveys, and I ask Egyptians, what do you think about the implementation of the Sharia? They're all for it.
Right.
If I ask them, how do you describe yourself politically? At least half of them will say Islami, when presented with ishtiraki, liberali, whatever, they'll say Islami. So the alternative hypothesis would be that, no, in fact, there is this very deep ideological commitment to some form of Islamic politics. And the reason that you see low support for individual parties at t equals 0 at some early point in time is because people are trying to figure out who really represents this view that I care about. And it becomes clear that it's these Salafis and it's the Ikhwan, and so people vote for them accordingly. So what data do you have that can really put the nail in the coffin of that alternative hypothesis?
Well, I think it's an important alternative hypothesis that we should keep in mind, and I don't think that it's completely wrong, actually. But the really important counter evidence is if they were voting for an ideological social program, then those should be the priorities that they list when we ask them what should the priorities of the next government be. Supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis, if they were voting for an ideological social program, should have had fundamentally different priorities for the next government than the liberals. And they didn't.
You think so? Maybe they, so for example, not to keep pushing you, but our priorities could be solving unemployment, all of the things that you listed, but we could believe that only Islam is the solution to those problems, right? So it's not necessarily, they're not that doesn't necessarily kill it.
Well, I mean, you could believe that, and I don't think that, I'm not saying that Egypt is not a country of secularists, okay? So I think the two can coexist. Egypt is, when you look at Egyptian public opinion, yes, there is strong support for Sharia. So if you go to the Egyptian people and say, let's eliminate any mention of Islam in the Constitution or Sharia in the Constitution, you'll get a great deal of opposition to that. However, there's also high support for fundamental freedoms. As long as you don't ask people to choose, you can have both. But when you push people to pick one or the other, and what I think was successfully done during the election is it became, to some degree, about identity. The liberals allowed the conversation to stray too much from from policy to identity, and then they were always going to be on losing ground. But when you actually look at people's real priorities, they are in agreement on what those are. Whether they believe that Islam is the only way to get to those things kind of doesn't matter in some ways, because at the end of the day, what they want the government to do isn't to change social norms. That's not the priority. So whether an American believes that Christian ethics are the way to fix the unemployment problem, essentially I don't care, as long as you're not trying to impose a specific ideological social program on the world. I don't really care what you think will create that outcome. If you think the priority of the government should be these outcomes, then that means that the people's priorities are basic results. When the first thing the parliament does is decides, let's eliminate women's right to initiate a divorce, they are actually acting in opposition to their constituents, not only their priorities, but actually their opinion. Because supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, we don't have a big enough sample at the time to actually look at the Salafis, but the Freedom and Justice Party supporters are more likely than the general public to support a woman's right to initiate a divorce. So the idea that this is the real kind of message to Parliament is, if you start to take these social things and you think that your vote was an ideological mandate to recreate Egypt in some kind of in your vision of what that ideological vision should be, you're wrong. That's not people's priority, and you're actually not even following through on your own supporters' values.
We have a lot of questions, so we'll start here. Yes.
Hi, thanks so much, Don. It's great to see you. And for what it's worth, I've been in Egypt for the last couple of months, and anecdotally, everything you say seems absolutely true to me and important.
Great.
I've spoken to. I have some questions that didn't come up, and I don't know if they're relevant. One, I didn't notice any impact of the November-December riots on your data. What would be the impact there? I would have thought that would also have a negative impact on the United States. Here again and again, the United States is associated with the Made in the USA bullets and tear gas. And then secondly, what is the impact, or maybe you haven't had a chance to measure it yet, of the NGO crisis and the USA getting our people out and meanwhile the Egyptians are still in the cage. And then giving the money anyway to the staff as quickly as possible. I don't know if you've gotten any sense of that yet. And then finally, women. What have you done on women and the essential vaporization of women from political life? Great question.
All great questions. I'll start with women, and I deliberately left women out because we're releasing a report on women after the Arab Spring in a few weeks, so I didn't want to steal our thunder there. So it's coming out, and wait and see. It'll be exciting and fun. But just to give you a preview, just to start with that, women and men have very similar priorities. Again, the differences are very faint. But the real the real obstacles for women right now are this security deficit, or the perception of a security deficit, which impacts women even worse than men. And so on a public level, it hurts. It could potentially be an extra impediment to their participation in public life. But on the
people don't trust women to take care of that, or the women themselves are more scared.
No, they're more scared. Women are scared. Women are afraid of yeah. But they're being left out of the political process. That's another issue. That's another problem that I think that we will have to work through in a lot of different ways. But one of the issues, unfortunately, is that women's rights in Egypt have been conflated too much and tainted by the old regime. And so that decoupling and rebranding women's rights, and Suzanne Mubarak will be a part of this process. The impact of the NGO crisis, I think, is seen in that slide on the opposition to aid, to U.S. aid to civil society has gotten worse. Opposition to U.S. aid to political groups has also gotten worse in light of the NGO problem. So the public feels that, I mean, unsurprising, they're not sympathetic to the American NGOs. I mean, as blunt as and sad as that is as hard as that is to say, they do see them as, the majority do see them as being disruptive or there to stir up trouble or destabilize Egypt. And
Does that mean, excuse me, do they feel the same way about Egyptians working for human rights? Because those are the people who are left.
Yeah, no, they may or may not. I don't know, but the specific question was on American funded, that they oppose American funding to NGOs. It's not a question about opposing these NGOs, but I mean, and many of these NGOs will actually have, and we've talked to them, have actually refused any outside funding, period, because of the backlash that they get from the public when they find out about outside funding. I think your first question, Cynthia, was
about the violence, November, December.
Yeah, I was really surprised at how little of an impact that it seemed to have on the public. It's very interesting how resilient public confidence in the SCAF has been.
Dalia, can I help you a little on that? I just find that the level of xenophobia in Egypt is so high now because of what state media has been feeding the public. There's a lot of talk about invisible hands and foreign agendas, and a lot of people actually believe it. And also there's a deep-rooted anger at the United States for supporting Mubarak for 30 years. And I think that answers your question about the rejection of economic aid. This deep-rooted anger at the American administration for supporting Mubarak, and because of the government continuing to tell people that there are invisible hands and that there is a foreign agenda being carried out. And that also explains why the popularity of the April 6th movement has dwindled over time. Let me just mention, this is Shahira Amin, a well-known journalist.
I do want to, I think you're right, and I do want to add, though, that we wanted to know, so there is a theory, of course I'm sure everyone has sort of heard this, that all of these revolutions are the product of outside influence. So we wanted to know how popular of an idea that was within the Arab public. And in Egypt, the vast majority don't believe that. They do believe that the Arab uprisings are the product of the people actually wanting change. And there's only a minority that believes that they are the product of outside meddling, and it's only in the low teens. So while that idea is being fed to them, I do see it in state media on a regular basis, there is a resistance to it, and most people do believe that the uprisings are indigenous and real.
So I had one, sir, in the queue.
Just I have a question about the security deficit that was addressed in this platform, the actual costs. Have we been any deeper to find out what are the assumptions, how did this big difference or big gap happen? Could you pose the question and who would benefit from that? Did you try to look at that with the platform?
Yeah, I did. Well, a couple things. First of all, here are some of my surprises. So what I did is I looked at who wants the military to remain in politics, who wants the military to leave, or who thinks it's a good thing and a bad thing for the military to remain in politics. So what I expected, my hypothesis, was that people who want the military to stay are more afraid. People who want the military to leave are less afraid. And it was actually the opposite. Amazing. People who want the military to leave or think it's a bad thing for the country for the military to stay are more afraid, think that the country has become more chaotic, and potentially actually blame the transitional authority. People who feel safe or who aren't afraid to walk alone at night are more likely to feel comfortable with there's a link between that and not minding if the military stays. The other thing about people who want the military to stay is, again, they are less educated. So if they're not really thinking through, what does that mean when the military stays in politics? That's a good thing. So are you just sort of thinking the military is good, I have confidence in them, they should stay? It's a minority. I quite honestly, with Egypt's history, with Egypt's demographic, for it to only be about 25% of the people thinking it's a good thing for the military to stay in politics is really quite impressive, in my opinion. Most Egyptians, despite the history of Egypt always having basically a military ruler, don't want it anymore and want to move on.
You mentioned 85% they trust the council, right? So how 25% they don't want, 85%?
No, it's because they have confidence in SCAF, but even though they have confidence in SCAF, don't want them to remain in politics after the presidential election. So that's what I was saying, is confidence in SCAF, doesn't mean stay forever.
Yes.
So do you have, first, thank you so much. Do you have any numbers for the presidential elections or the candidates?
Yeah.
We as Egyptians at MIT, we have a huge talk on how to predict the numbers or the supporters for each presidential candidate.
Yeah. We do have, we've been asking that over time, and again, the most frequent response is don't know. That's actually the majority until now. Don't have somebody chosen. And then the highest person after that is Amr Musa, and by quite a bit.
Could you explain to me Google Egypt just released the numbers that hasn't Ismail has the highest search on the web for his videos from history. That might indicate something of if you can elaborate on that.
So their methodology is different than ours. Okay, so let me just give a little, just briefly what our methodology, to explain what I mean by a nationwide representative survey. We do in-home face-to-face interviews. So we don't, discriminate based on people who have the internet or people who don't, or phone or not, or can read or write or not. Every single Egyptian has a chance of being included in the sample. So it actually represents the entire population, both countryside and city. The whole country is represented, age 15 years and above. And so we will get a more accurate picture. I mean, it is a representative picture, whereas things like Google, any internet poll it just represents the people who happen to take the poll. It has absolutely no power of projecting to the population. So I'm always getting Facebook polls or before when Barada was winning, or was running rather, and in our poll was he was 2%. But in every Facebook poll, he was 45%. Well, he should be the president of Facebook, but he's not going to win an election in Egypt. So it's just, we really have, I just kind of ignore, internet polls altogether because they're very unrepresentative.
What she's talking about is not it's underrepresented, but for a different reason. It's not an internet poll. It's Google search patterns. So I've worked with this data too. And so that basically is all the people the relative search volume for different candidates. But remember, I can search for Hazem Ismail because I'm scared of him, not because I want to vote for him. So we really can, it adds, there's the unrepresentative part, but then there's the part that this isn't really getting us anything on the valence user.
So followers aren't necessarily fans.
Right.
Dalia, thank you so much for your comments. We first met at a conference on religion and foreign policy, which makes me sort of wonder, in all the data that you've collected, we already know the answer to the question about women. We're going to have to wait for gender gaps in any of these. But have you also disaggregated this data in terms of religious identity? And is there a difference in perspective in the Christian minority?
We haven't done a great deal of that, and it's mostly because of sample size not being high enough. There's only been a few things where we've been able to have enough of a Christian representation to look at differences, and there's very few differences that I can report. The views have been pretty much the same across the religious spectrum. But it's something that as we collect more and more, we can actually do a formal study of what do Christians versus Muslims think in Egypt. We haven't been able to do that yet.
Can I ask you a follow-up on that?
Yeah.
What percentage of your sample ends up being Christian?
Around 8%.
You get 8. That's higher than any other survey that I've seen. They all get between 4 and 6%. So that's
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yes.
Just a question. Going back to your thesis on if people get surveillance-based policies like some have public sector solutions for unemployment, it demonstrates it's not an ideological concept. Do you have any examples of ideological groups who have been elected, who haven't just gone on surveillance-based policies, who actually projected policies that were ideologically motivated? Because I would assume that's how the majority of parties who then carry out ideological-based agendas all stand on surveillance-based political platforms.
Well, I think that what we're seeing in the initial conversations and draft bills in the Parliament is what I mean when I say that that's exactly the opposite of what the Egyptian people are expecting, because the really important things are very hard to do. They are focusing on, in some cases, more ideological social issues, like targeting, aspects of Egyptian family law around women's right to initiate a divorce. That's an example of what the public, even their own supporters, don't want them to be focusing on. So, that's the example I'm giving. What's actually happening today or starting to happen today, is what the research shows is not the expectation of the public.
The reason, because you made similarities to the American establishment. What's interesting is that a lot of colleagues, despite social concerns, they vote on whether you tax me or whether you're not taxing me. So the question becomes, if the conglomerate and the Salafists can create employment opportunities, will people forgive them of their conservative social agenda? And I don't know if you have data on that, but that I would say would probably be the key question. So if they could sort out the problem, then if the sociological factors just be the here or there for the population.
It may very well not be. It's just not what people put them in Parliament to do. That was essentially my point. I don't know how forgiving they will be if they deliver on the priorities and also do all these other things. That I don't know.
Matt?
Hi, my name is Matt Lewis from the National Security Fellow, and my question is on you talked about the impact that USAID has on the public. And if I was a U.S. congressman listening to your speech, I would say, as we debate very tough decisions about budget, and we're looking to make cuts, that I'm getting very little for an investment into Egypt. I'm only getting a 12% approval rating, let's say. And so the conclusion I would draw from is that why are we giving Egypt so much money? So my question to you is, what advice would you give to a U.S. policymaker in terms of continuing to provide assistance? Now, to add to that, there's two comments on that. The first one is, I'm worried about the economic situation, the lack of reserves that Egypt has. And although the public might feel it's sort of a response to colonialism. We don't want U.S. influence. We just want them out of there, not realizing the impact that the funds really have on the economy.
Right.
And the second one is, a lot of the money does go to a relationship we have, a close one with the Egyptian military. And as you look at the Arab Spring, you look at the response that the militaries have had, the Egyptian military, although not perfect, has provided some stability and a transition process that in a place like Syria right now, we don't have that opportunity to split them from Assad. That regime and that military is so closely tied, we would have a hard time splitting them because we just don't have a relationship with the Syrian military. So again, the question is what's your advice to U.S. policymakers when it comes to the future of foreign aid to Egypt?
Well, it's a great question. I guess I would say it's a great question for Congress. I would say that I think the reason that Congress gives Egypt aid is not to buy U.S. approval of the U.S. I don't think that many people in Congress believe that that's what we're getting back. What we are getting back is a peace treaty, right? So that's what we get back. So I think Congress will continue to give that aid. Now, how should we invest that aid if we are going to be giving it regardless, and including military aid? I do think that there are ways to provide greater transparency around the aid. How is it being used? What is it going into? How is it creating, or is it, and how can it create capacity rather than dependence within Egypt. So there's a lot of different ways that I think that money can be invested in the Egyptian people, where they see it as truly helping them rather than creating a sort of economic slavery.
The second part of the question.
What was the second part that I missed?
The fact that they've maintained stability, which is what the military may be telling Congress. But in truth, they've made every single mistake in the book. All of Mubarak's mistakes, from virginity tests on female protesters to military trials for over 12,000 civilians, to security vacuum, a total mess.
What questions for?
She mentioned at the beginning of her talk that the audience can also participate in answering the questions.
Sure.
If I may put in my
Please do.
5 pennies worth of comments here, I think my response would be to the gentleman from National Security in that I think the United States government is a lot more intelligent than making a military investment anywhere in the world without any payoff back. So that is a fact that needs to be taken very seriously. The fact that over 30% of the Egyptian economy is literally owned, if not controlled, by the military is a pure, for one thing, economic investment for the U.S. as well as the Egyptian partner in terms of the military apparatus. So there is an economic profit from there. In addition to that, there is a security.
We only have Delia for 7 more minutes, and I'd really love to hear more from her. So if you could just, conclude.
She allowed me to talk, so I would.
But many of us are here to listen to her.
You're taking my time. Okay?
It's Delia's time.
So we need to take the idea of military investment, both economically and militarily, into account. Second is the question of the Israeli peace talk. She mentioned peace talks, but there is an Israeli element in there which needs to be taken into account. Israel is an extremely important element here as far as the U.S. partnership is concerned. Thirdly, I believe the United States is also interested. This military aid is geared towards approachment to Egypt against possible antagonists against the U.S.-Israeli alliance in the region, namely Iran, Syria, and others. So there is a great deal of military benefit that the United States gets out of it as well as
My name is Mahela Khan. I'm the author of Tumultuous Movement, Egyptian in America. And thank you to this book that I want to know from your studies, if you think like the winning of Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafi, representing just the people, reflecting the desire for people to express themselves in talking rather than having an idea about how to choose. Do you think this is a real thing on the ground, and having the name of Islamist as a naming rather than having a political agenda? And do you expect, one time when people say more and see it, they are going to have a real political agenda on the ground, solving the real problems about employment and security and stuff like that? Do you think people later on will keep looking for people who are getting a political agenda for real on the ground rather than names and name of the party? And the other thing is that when you're talking about the political, American aid for people's Egyptian economy, do you think, or do you have any idea that you're going to have some studies about economic support from Egyptians abroad, not from different governments and different people, from Egyptian abroad, to support the Egyptian economy and Egyptian people in being a part of the community in Egypt? What do you expect about that?
Mm-hmm. So quite a bit there. First, was the vote for the Muslim Brotherhood one for ideological, or was it more just people being enthusiastic about voting and voting for names rather than a political platform? And will they, will they adjust their vote if things aren't delivered upon? I think that's your question. I mean, I think the answer is a likely yes. First, this is the first time Egyptians have ever voted in an election that most people believe was legitimate. I mean, it's literally maybe the first time ever in Egypt that there was an election like that. So there's no history. There's nothing to go on. People are going to vote for maybe the only person that reached out to them, someone that they are familiar with and trust and have seen do things in the community, so they're voting for them. They're not necessarily voting for an ideology. But what's really important is that people now are a lot more politically engaged. They are watching and waiting for what that politician, what that person in parliament is going to deliver. They aren't checked out. They aren't observers anymore in their country. They're actually active participants. So the next time around, and many people said this, they said, well, we'll vote for X, Y, or Z, and if they don't deliver the next time around, we'll vote for someone else. Now, if you look at other countries who've had kind of an experiment with letting Islamist parties or any other party participate in elections, whether it's in Asia, in Indonesia, or Malaysia, or in Jordan, or in other parts of the Arab world, what you find is the same thing. Almost every time, the first time that Islamists are allowed to compete, they win a huge chunk of parliament. They're the kind of the first choice. And then as time goes on, they either rotate out, their popularity ebbs and flows depending on their performance. So we've seen that already happen in other parts, in other democracies around the Muslim majority world. And I think that that's what's going to happen in Egypt. It'll just depend on their performance. People aren't going to just keep voting for someone because they call themselves a certain name. Yes, and the role of Egyptians abroad, and it's not something we've studied, but I think it would be worth looking at, but it's not something that I have a lot of information on now.
You said that most of the issues of the people were economic, more employment, better standard of living. In the campaign to the elections, did the parties outline how they were going to do that? Is there an new economic model, or what are they going to do that's different than what they done before, Islamic banking, or is there any plan of how they go about spending government money, stimulus, whatever? It really varied. There is an economic platform that the Freedom and Justice Party has put forth. I'm not familiar with the details of it. All I know is that I've read reviews of it and that it does exist, and the scholars that have studied platforms of different parties thought that it, sort of like a good start. But the answer is really that there's very little detail at this point as to what will happen. Because I've heard very little, I've heard very few alarm bells around their economic program. And what I've read of the analysis of it is that it seems to basically be not all that different from what any other party has been putting forth. There isn't this radical new thing that's out there. I think there's a lot of the same standard issues around trying to attract investment, creating jobs that way, and so forth.
So I think we have time for one more question.
Yes, well, I agree with what you said about the Egyptian Israeli peace treaty being largely the reason for U.S. aid, because as long as Egypt remains a signatory to the treaty, no other Arab country can attack Israel, and this is obviously in the interest of the United States. I think there will be some variation in the policy, although all the candidates, as far as I know, have said they support the treaty. But this is the keystone of the rationale of American aid to Egypt.
Yes, I agree with that.
On that note, please join me in thanking Dalia.